Welcome to the Life Rocks podcast. In this podcast, we explore how nature, science, education, and culture can benefit all children and future generations. This is a show for educators, parents, mentors, and anyone interested in making the lives of our children, families, and communities better. So sit back, take a breath, and enjoy the show. And now for your host, Asher Cloran.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Life Rocks podcast. I'm very happy today to have on the show a world-leading expert on cold ocean birds, an Antarctic researcher, PhD on emperor penguin research, bird ecologist, and photographer who has been heavily involved in innovating and improving practices in the fishing industry to help protect ocean birds. Without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Graham Robertson onto the show today. How are you, Dr. Graham?
Pretty good, thanks, Sasha. Good to be here.
Excellent. And you're down in Tasmania at the moment?
Yeah, we live here. We've been here for 30 odd years. And even though I've retired, I think we're staying here.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place and nice and close to the Antarctic, and probably lots of seabirds happening down in Tassie as well.
Yeah, in the higher latitudes, I guess you could say, for Australia. And further south, the more you get into the realm of the Southern Ocean and all the albatrosses and petrels and penguins that reside there.
It's such an amazing and beautiful world that we live in. And I think all of the work that you've done with ocean birds really stands out, just how much passion and connection that you've had to these animals. And I'm so curious to dive into exactly why and how and what really sparked your interest in biology and conservation and these sort of things. So was there a moment when you were younger, or things that were in or a part of your childhood that led you onto this road?
Yeah, I grew up on an orchard, a citrus farm in Riverina area of New South Wales. And so I was exposed to agriculture from a very young age. And I went to an agricultural boarding school for boys. And then after that, I did tertiary level agriculture. So I ended up as a 21-year-old, about that age. I didn't really have an intrinsic interest in agriculture, so I was floundering a bit. And I think my father might have intuited something, and he suggested I apply for a job with the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, which I did, and I ended up lucking out and got a job working out of Sydney on kangaroos in Western New South Wales and various other things. So I quickly realised within a few days I'd fallen on my feet with that position. So I must have had an innate interest in the natural world and wildlife. But I think the icing on the cake really happened when I hitchhiked through Southern Africa in my very early 20s. I spent about 3 months there hitchhiking and got exposed to the African wildlife, big game as they were called, and national parks, and pretty blown away by that. And I reckon that just cemented, my keenness to get involved work-wise, employment-wise, in elements of the natural world. It also kickstarted my interest in photography, as I was bound to, I guess.
So how did the time in Africa then lead to your interest in cold ocean seabirds? Because this is worlds apart.
I used to work as a plant ecologist in Western New South Wales for quite a long time. I think up until through the 70s, up until the up until about 1980. I was working in Western New South Wales, and then I think it was in about 1980, my wife and I came down for a bushwalking trip to Tasmania for a month.
Yeah.
And at the end of that trip, I had a chance to accompany a local colleague from from Tasmania here, out to Albatross Island, a sort of rock stack in Bass Strait, which is home to the shy albatross species,
Okay.
the local species here. And that was a life changer because I loved everything about it. You know, the trip out to the island in an old hue and pine fishing boat that was chartered, and even the seasickness wasn't too bad. Sleeping on deck, the landing, you know, the difficulty, the physical side of getting all the gear ashore.
Yep.
And camping in a cave, you know, long, high cave that was almost the size of a ballroom, just the way it was. And,
Wow.
you know, with the fairy prawns yelling out through the night during their courtship phase. And then, of course, the albatrosses, you know, these big, bold, handsome, beautiful birds.
Yes.
You know, going about their ways, and they'd fly into the island, you know, hanging in the wind, and everything was great. The sea spray coming over the top. So when I came back from that 4 or 5 day trip, I realised I needed to have a career change
Hmm.
from arid zone botany to cold ocean seabird ecology. So then, you know, I looked around, and there's hardly any, well, the only biologist I knew working in the Southern Ocean on albatrosses and penguins and the like, worked at the Antarctic Division, and that person employed the odd expeditioner, you know, to go south on a contract.
Yeah.
So I thought, you know, got Buckley's chance of getting a job here. So rather than giving up, I thought I'd just, you know, build up some experience and just try to put myself in a better position to maybe crack a job if one came up. So I took a couple of private trips. I went over to where I was pretty besotted by albatrosses at that point. So I went over to a place called Torishima, which is a volcanic island about 200 kilometres south of Tokyo.
Hmm.
I went out with a colleague, or newfound colleague, a Japanese fellow, for 10 days, where the short-tailed albatross bred and still does. It's an endangered species. I was just trying to gain familiarity, you know, and understand them better. And I was attracted to their courtship behaviour, which is pretty interesting for all albatrosses. Did a bit of photography, but mainly learning about them. And then I went across to Midway Atoll, which is a small island in the Hawaiian Leeward Islands.
Yep.
And that's home to the black-footed and the Laysan albatross. Doing the same thing, learning about their history and their biology. After that, I applied for a job. Well, it wasn't a job, it was a volunteer position. I took time off work to go to Macquarie Island, the subantarctic island south of here, about 1,000 k's south of Tasmania,
Okay.
to work on gentoo penguins, not albatrosses, but gentoo penguins, because it was a priority species for the management body at the time.
Yep.
So I spent 5 months there working on gentoos, and you know, I wrote a couple of papers and published them, and it's good to have a publication background if you want to go for a job.
Yep.
Then a bit of time passed, and lo and behold, a position came up with the Antarctic Division when they advertised for a overwintering expeditioner to work at Mawson Station on emperor penguins. So I applied for that. You know, I would have walked over hot coals in bare feet to get that position. I lucked out with that, and then went to Mawson and studied emperors for 14 months and came back and wrote the research up. By that time, the issue of seabirds dying in longline fisheries around the world became a pressing global issue. And as soon as I heard about that event, or those events,
Yep.
I kind of transitioned again. I knew I wasn't going to keep working with emperors. I was going to work in try to mitigate the impacts of longline fisheries on seabirds, which is comes back to motivation once again. I sometimes think back, why would I leave the emperor work, which I thought was it's a dream job for a field biologist to work on emperor penguins.
Yes.
But I just segued without prior thought, and I think it comes back to your factory settings. You can be influenced by things when you're young, but some of it's just hardwired into you. And I think I was always really unconsciously aiming towards working at the interface between primary industry, in this case, longline fisheries, and conservation science with seabirds. So I segued into that area, seabird conservation and fisheries, to work at that interface I just referred to, which it's not just doing science and, the end of the science process is usually the paper published in international refereed literature.
Yep.
In the conservation domain, that's not really the end of it. It's a matter of then taking the findings from your research, whether they be on birds or whether they be on fishing vessels, which you're experimenting with modified techniques so they don't affect birds so much, taking those findings into the management fora, multi-stakeholder working groups, if you like, domestic and international, and trying to argue for the compromise, how seabirds can survive and fisheries can survive as well. And that's always pretty tricky. But that's where the real progress can be made. I mean, it makes it really difficult because you're dealing with people and entrenched human behaviour, but when you get a win there, it's pretty satisfying.
That is such a fascinating journey. And I think just the ultimate accomplishment for a scientist is to do the research in nature, but then to bring it to the world and to push that into industry, because that is really where the rubber meets the road with research. And unless people are out there actively making the evidence of that research effective and practical in the world, then science can be a bit of a waste of time unless it's equally mobilized at the other end. So I think that that's absolutely fantastic, and probably something that our audience not initially thinks of, like seabirds being affected by the fishing industry. It seems obvious once you say it, but I think the general sentiment of most people is to think that fisheries, the main problem they'd cause would be overfishing. But how did you come across the impact that the fishing industry in particular was having on seabirds, and how was that revealed through the work that you did in Antarctica? And just before you launch into that, I want to share an amazing photo of Graham in his dream job. And you mentioned walking over hot coals to get there, but to be honest, Graham, it looks like quite the opposite here. So there's
got that from somewhere.
And this is the Mawson Antarctic expedition, where you spent time on the ice for a whole winter, if I'm not mistaken. So tell us a bit about this photo and that experience, and how it really was for you going through those extreme temperatures and spending that time.
Well, my job when I overwintered with the emperors, my job was to study their feeding ecology, which is like studies of the relationship between the birds and the marine environment that sustains them.
Okay.
And emperors breed on what's called fast ice. It's frozen seawater, which you might call sea ice. But fast ice is actually fast onto something. In other words, it's sort of stuck against something.
Okay.
Like rocks or grounded icebergs. And emperor penguins seek out fast ice to breed on because it's stable and won't break out before their chicks fledge and drown them all. So I worked at two colonies near Mawson Station. One was called Auster, Auster, named for the Ulster aircraft that was used in its discovery in the 1950s. That was 55 kilometres east of Mawson, and the other one was called Taylor Glacier Colony, which was 95 kilometres west of Mawson. So basically the work I decided to do was all the basic pillars of what you'd call feeding ecology, which was to study the birds' diet composition, what prey species they were taking from the ocean, among the various species that make up fish, squid, and types of krill, and their rates of food consumption, by determining how much food emperors took from the ocean to get through the whole breeding cycle, and how much food it required to raise a chick from go to woe. That's about a 5-month growing period before the chicks fledge. So that was fairly complicated, but it enabled me to sort of put together a type of food budget. If the colony I worked on at Ulster had 12,000 breeding pairs, so you could work out their total annual food requirements for breeding adults plus their offspring. Was fairly useful to have. And I also studied their diving depths and the foraging space, by putting instruments on the birds when they left the colony and retrieving the devices and interrogating when they came back to the colony. So you could sort of construct a 3-dimensional feeding space in the ocean, how far they went from the edge of the ice, north and east and west, if you like, and how deep they dived, what areas of the water column they exploited. And as well as that, I did a couple of demographic things like population estimations, because the emperors are notoriously difficult to count because they're not territorial. They sort of wander around and they don't have a fixed nest site that you might be able to more easily count. So I set up some long-term counts, and that's what the photograph shows with me there in the tripod. Down to Taylor Glacier, where there's a little prominence sort of more or less above the bird. So it was purpose-built for oblique photography from an elevated point down on the birds. And when the males were huddling in the winter, when they're incubating eggs, and females are at sea, they huddle together like very densely packed, like a rugby scrum. And you could photograph these from the position and just count the birds in the computer, count them in Photoshop and get very accurate estimates. So that count's been going on for the last 30 years. And so we got a 30-year time series for that particular colony. So yeah, that pretty well cut out my activities.
Must have been such an amazing time. Is this Rogers Lodge in the photographs related to where you were staying? Is that the place where you observed the penguins?
Yeah, that's 8 kilometres from Ulster Colony, not Taylor Glacier, the one to the east of Mawson called Ulster. And you're not permitted to camp on the sea ice, the fast ice, in case it breaks out, which it hardly would ever do. If emperor penguins are breeding there, they know what they're doing. But it's just no H&S considerations. They had to camp on some solid substrate. There's a little island 8 k's from the colony called Macy Island. It's only about 10 metres above sea level, or level of the sea ice. So since I was the first overwintering biologist to work on emperor penguins at Mawson, we equipped a 20-foot sea container. That's the red part in that photograph, red object. Put 4 bunks in it and a sink and a cooker, and put it on a sledge and towed it out there and took it up on top of the island and secured it to the rock with rock bolts and guy wires. And when I was there, it didn't have that, looks like a panelled in section to the left of the green area, which has got Rogers Lodge written on it. That exists. That photograph was taken much later and sent to me. We just had the Rogers Lodge add-on. That's what we call a cold porch. So you had a sort of double door entry. You'd open the door and walk into that first, and then you'd shut the door behind you and then open the door to the 20-foot container and walk in. So that double door system prevented spin drift from sort of blasting into the interior spaces when no one was there. So
There you
yeah,
go.
I spent a lot of time in that hut.
You got some fond memories of this hut, I bet. And you can
Yeah.
see the penguins just out on the rocks down below there.
Yeah, they're not emperors. They're called the daily penguins. They're little guys.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're about 4.5, 5 kilos, you could say, whereas an emperor penguin can be 35, 40 kilos. Yeah, much bigger bird. Yeah.
Do you think people would be surprised with the amount of bird life that actually is down in the Antarctic?
Yeah, I think so. It's not so much in terms of species richness. There aren't huge numbers of species.
Yes.
There's huge abundance among some species. Very big colonies, and particularly the flying birds, as you can see there. They're albatrosses, black-browed albatrosses, but the smaller petrels that breed in Antarctica, like Wilson's storm petrels one, there's millions of them in Antarctica.
Mm.
The photograph you can see there is not in Antarctica itself, it's in the subantarctic. But it's it's an example of colonially breeding seabirds. They breed about 50 centimetres apart.
Yes.
Albatrosses on mud nests that they've gouged out of the ground themselves, and they're sitting on eggs. I suppose the other thing that's interesting there is they're all facing the same direction. They always face into the wind.
Okay.
And that's why they all look so uniform. But
yeah, they're very neat. And what is that reason for facing into the wind?
I think it's more comfortable to face into the wind. So if they had their backs to the wind would sort of run into their feathers and ruffle it and go up under their wings, and might be a bit chilling. Also, if the wind blows strongly, the only way they can, when I say strong, say 60 knots or so.
Yep.
That's pretty strong. The only way they can stay on the nest is to point into it, and they put their heads where they've got a nest mound. Those nest mounds in the photograph aren't very high, but sometimes they could be 0.5 metre or even 1 metre high.
Oh.
They put their heads down over the front of the nest mound and pretty much dig their bill into the mud, so that the wind actually hits the back of their neck and forces their body down, in effect,
Mm.
And not lifts them up. If their breasts sort of lift up with gusts of wind, they could end up tumbling backwards off the egg with strong enough wind. So it's a strategy to be holdfast to the nest in strong winds.
And are these all female birds because they're nesting, or is it shared?
Shared, yeah. I couldn't tell there. You'd have to make bill measurements of those birds to work out which one's a male and which one's a female. But from a distance, they all look the same.
Yeah. Absolutely fascinating. So studying their life, studying their breeding cycle, studying their eating habits, how did some of these ideas and understandings and research inform your work as you moved into the fishing industry to protect these cold ocean birds? Or was it always in the back of your mind as something that needed work that was already a known factor to you?
Yeah, I started off with my interest in albatross. Well, even when, like I said before, when I took the trip to Albatross Island in Bass Strait, I got fascinated by albatrosses. Largely their beauty sort of took my breath away more than anything.
Mm.
But then when I wrote up my work on emperor penguins and moved into longline fishing and seabird conservation, I gravitated to a part of the world that had the most number of the type of longline fishing vessels that took most of the albatrosses and petrels, took their lives incidentally around the Southern Ocean. So I ended up doing a lot of work around the Cape Horn region in southern Chile, and so I did a lot of collaborative research with the fishing industry. Worked with on fishing boats while I was production fishing, or when I managed to raise money I had enough money sometimes to charter industrial-sized longline boats for a couple of weeks and go and do designed experiments that were, very clinically conducted by taking control of the entire fishing operation, to try to come up with different methods of setting their gear, to try to get their baited hooks to sink faster so they wouldn't catch so many birds, things like that. I ended up spending 30 years doing that sort of work in, I think, 9 different countries around the world, systematically working through all the commercial longline fisheries in the world that take seabirds, to try to put solutions on the table for each fishing method. So in conjunction with doing that work, it was useful to know if you understood the impact of the fisheries on the seabirds and the seabird colonies sort of around where the fishing grounds are. I decided to frequent some of these breeding sites for albatrosses and petrels, and do research programs that were targeted at managing the fishery. And the most obvious thing were 2 things: population estimates, so you could track the trends in numbers.
Yep.
So you could tell management agencies whether the population is going up or down or stable. And secondly, did a lot of satellite tracking, putting small satellite transmitters on the birds' backs, on their back feathers, and tracking their foraging movements at sea, to quantify the overlap between all the types of fisheries in their foraging zones that could take their lives incidentally. That might have meant deep water fisheries for Patagonian toothfish, surface longline fisheries for tunas and swordfish, as well as trawl fisheries for small pelagic fish, from down near Antarctica all the way through to, in the case of South America, the latitude of say Santiago, the capital of Chile. So it's a very wide area. So that took me to the islands, and to build a body of work that was complementary to the work I was doing on fishing vessels themselves.
Fantastic. And this issue of byline fisheries and all the different styles of fishing that are taking place out there is that the birds get attracted to the large amounts of fish and then they get caught in the nets. And so can you share with us some of the innovations, the recommendations, the suggestions that you've made into the fishing industry and how that alters their practice and how it saves ocean birds?
Yes. So I would say, pardon me, in contrast to the work I was doing on emperor penguins, which is basic ecological work.
Yes.
You call it applied ecology, I guess. The work on seabirds I'd call more like policy-specific work, where you could take a policy, let's say it's a conservation measure for a fisheries management organisation, conservation measure dealing with seabirds.
Yeah.
And try to, if birds are still dying under that conservation measure, try to improve the conservation measure.
Yes.
By a process of science. So, so it's a matter of, like I said, doing research to understand cause and effect, collaborating with fishermen, trying different techniques, doing robust science which could stand up in international working groups. Take the the backlash from some members of the fishing industry from time to time.
Yeah.
And try to work that through management agencies and get it embedded in conservation measures, and then hopefully have observer programs that could enforce the application of those measures. So I suppose the early on in my career with Seabird bycatch mitigation, I got lucky pretty early on. I worked in New Zealand with a fishing company there.
Yeah.
It was very proactive, very keen to make a difference. They were catching Patagonian toothfish in Antarctica and a species called ling around New Zealand itself. We have ling here in Australia.
I like ling, like eating ling.
And the fishing company were pretty much happy to try anything to reduce their seabird mortality.
Okay.
And we came up with, I worked in collaboration with a Longline gear manufacturer in Norway.
Yes.
And we came up with a new type of longline called integrated weight longline. So it's basically a standard longline for deep water use, about as thick as your finger, say, but it had a beaded lead core down the center. And after experimentation, I decided that a 50 gram per meter beaded lead core was probably going to be practical for fishermen to use and cost effective to buy. And from my testing with by attaching time depth sensors on the long lines, it sank much faster than the conventional long line. Not only did it sink faster to deeper depths, but it sank instantly. And it was heavy enough to resist the upwellings from the propeller, the vessel propeller, which floats the normal long line. It could penetrate down through that propeller turbulence and sink straight away. So we did experiments off the south coast of New Zealand, and we got with this new line compared to the conventional line, which is like a control, head-to-head comparison. And in our first breeding season for the seabirds, it's an annual thing.
Yep.
With worst case scenario seabirds in the mix behind the boat, we got a 95% reduction in mortality. And
that's fantastic.
That was astonishing. I thought, this could be an artifact. We better repeat this work in a subsequent year.
Yes.
Rather than into the conservation measure of the organisation that was managing the fishery at the time. We did it a second year, and we replicated those findings. And then
wow,
it was a matter of taking it to the appropriate conservation organisation that, in this case, I'm talking about the Southern Ocean fisheries down to Antarctica, and put it in the conservation measures, and it got the green light through the hierarchy of this management organisation. And of course, the chain reaction among all the fishing operators, they immediately converted to integrated weight longline, and that was in about 2003 or 4. So it's been in the mix for 20 years, and it's still there. So hasn't been kicked out of the way or taken over by some other method. So that was a great outcome, really. Those kind of outcomes aren't easy. It's it's hard to get to replicate that in other fisheries that don't have the sort of imperative to change as the one that I referred to.
That is absolutely fascinating.
Now, for those of you who don't know, Life Rocks is not just a podcast. It is an education foundation centered around connecting children to the magic of nature through earth sciences. As a self-funded foundation and startup, we are constantly seeking support so that we can continue our great work. So if you feel called to donate to Life Rocks, please head down to the show notes and find the relevant donation link. We accept regular money as well as cryptocurrencies. We greatly appreciate you, our Life Rocks community. Now, back to the show.
So, what makes a company willing to adopt the practice when it's so bleedingly obvious? You get a 95% reduction, and then you can prove it again, but then still there's parts of the industry that don't want to take it up. Maybe they're mired in whatever they think their bottom line is. What are the sort of challenges you faced in trying to get this through to certain people? And then what are the qualities of those groups that just adopt it straight away, like it's common sense?
Yeah, well, it boils down to, I think, I suppose in a perfect world, when seabird bycatch mitigation researchers like myself and colleagues around the world, when you're trying to develop what might become new practices and new techniques, they take a while to evolve, go through the R&D processes. Ideally, the regulations that govern the behaviour of the fishery evolve in parallel.
Yes.
because once you put solutions on the table, you can be sure that it's a bit of a step up for a fisherman. Sometimes it's not much of a step up, but sometimes it can be. There'll be a little bit extra cost, an extra procedure to do on vessels. After they get used to it, they don't know any different.
Yeah.
And young guys who come into the industry, they don't know any different either.
Mm.
But if the regulations haven't evolved, then uptake's going to be really difficult. And the example I gave you about the integrated weight longline and the adoption rate of that, the collaborative fishing company in New Zealand was taking its vessel into the Antarctic Ross Sea,
Yes,
to catch Antarctic toothfish, and into the subantarctic region to catch Patagonian toothfish.
yeah,
They're pretty valuable deep water, bottom dwelling fish. And you can, that's the sort of gear they use on the screen right now. They had an incentive to change their fishing practices because they were hell bent on maintaining their fishing license. They didn't want to be excluded, and they didn't want to be named and shamed in the annual meeting of all the stakeholders in this particular fishery, which involved a lot of people and 27, 28 countries involved. Yep. So they had an incentive to change. And prior to the development of the integrated weight longline, the working group in this organisation that governs the Southern Ocean fisheries, I was part of that working group. When we first allowed industrial longliners into Antarctica's Ross Sea to target toothfish, one of the conservation measures in general was setting the lines at night in the dark. So birds couldn't see the baited hooks.
Okay.
But in Antarctica in summer, there is no night. So we had to come up with an alternative conservation measure, and we just sort of winged it a bit. We set a minimum sink rate standard on the fishing gear, on the long line itself that carries the baited hooks. That happened to be 0.3 metres a second, and that's something that comes from research I did in the Falkland Islands in a fishery over there a couple of years before. But it wasn't really related to whether or not seabirds would be caught. It was just a practical change to the fishing gear that fishermen could cope with, 0.3 metres a second. It's not the speed at which albatrosses and petrels dive at. We didn't know that at the time. And the only way they could achieve the 0.3 metres a second was to attach 5 or 6 kilogram sort of lead sinkers to their long line every 30 or 40 metres as it was being paid out of the vessel. And when they hauled the bag in again, every time one of these weights came over the side, they had to stop the line hauler and take the weight off and somehow get it back to the stern of the vessel for the next set. Now that was an absolute pain in the backside doing that, stopping the line hauler and when ice all over that part of the boat and it's freezing. And so that opened the door to alternative techniques. And putting the weight inside the long line. And once it proved to be effective operationally and also with seabird conservation wise, that's how they just, once it was endorsed by the management organisation, that's when the chain reaction took place and they all adopted it. So they had an incentive. The short answer is they had an incentive.
So it shows exactly how crucial it is that governments and official bodies sort of put a bit of that pressure onto industry so that they can streamline these innovations that, do seem so simple, but they also take a large amount of observation, studying the speed that a bird travels and the speed that nets sink, and all of these different layers of details takes someone who's there observing and caring and thinking about these things. But really, it also, I think, as you said at the start of this podcast, it's like, your connection to nature, but you've also had to deal with humans and psychology and, corporate enterprise and all of their different agendas. Have you, in this process of getting this work to the world, and found a lot of support in terms of being given funding or being given the resources needed to create these innovations? Has that been something that was driven through that partnership with those key companies, or was it something that more you were given money to invest into those technologies and into that research from other places?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of these things are expensive, but I think after the success of the integrated weight Longline and its uptake by the Patagonian toothfish longline fishery down south, I linked up with other organisations. I developed a relationship with the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, as in Packard Computers, Hewlett and Packard Computers in the USA, and received a lot of funding from them. They were fantastic.
Great.
And I ended up getting a Marine Conservation Fellowship from the Pew Charitable Trust in the USA, which, you know, it was worth about $250,000 Australian dollars over 3 years. And the work I was doing, and also complemented by photography, of course.
Yes.
But I found a natural home in the Antarctic tourism industry. Naturalists on board could give lectures to the tourists when they were going down to some of the subantarctic islands, like Macquarie Island here in Australia, South Georgia in the South Atlantic, and various places, talking about seabird conservation in fisheries, following a protocol that I'd given them. And I used to supply them photographic prints, and at the end of the cruises, they'd auction them off and raise money, and they raised several $100,000. So from about 2005 or 6, from then on, I was pretty well self-sufficient, you know, with external funds to do some of these projects I referred to, which, you know, sometimes on one occasion I chartered a 50-metre longline fishing boat with about a crew of about 30 out of southern Argentina for 15 days at sea, and we weren't catching any fish to offset our costs. Doing a designed experiment, just setting the line, hauling it. I had a lot of instruments deployed over and over and over and over, and had the funds to do probably the best controlled experiment I've ever done in my life, because working in fisheries, when they're production fishing, there's so many confounding effects that can undermine the integrity of your results, things you can't control, and the data can be a mess. But when you charter the vessel, the data is just as clean as you like. You know, such a pleasure to be able to put a report on the table of a working group that's about to make some key decisions, and you can put your hand on your heart and say that you believe the data because you were there and you collected it. So anyway, the funding was critical, and these external donors they were just champions.
And it shows how many people it takes to create something good, and you led the way with your awareness and research, but it still took many other people to support to enact this stuff into the world. And I think that's a real message to any leaders or any groups out there, and anyone listening who has influence to make stuff happen. It's all about connecting to people who are going to innovate, who are going to change the way things are done, because it's in every industry. And I can liken that to things within say agriculture as well, where we did things one way for so many years, and then this is now obviously shown up in losing topsoil and all of this sort of stuff. So unless we listen to people who know another way, who can innovate, who can change the technology we have, what hope does the natural world have nowadays? And I think your photography being paired with your scientific mind has been a perfect combination to get your message across. Like you said, some of the photographs were auctioned off for money that then fed your research and other projects. But I want to show a photo here that's definitely in line with seabird conservation, and a bit of a a graphic warning here on this one, but this really does show the nature of some of the work that Graham's been doing and is passionate about. Yeah, but so when people are taking hooks, they have to take hooks out of fish, otherwise it can end up in birds like this.
Yeah, Ash, I'll have to go into a bit of a detail here. At the bottom right-hand side, you can see that little motif that says camellia.
Yep.
And in the middle of that, there's a schematic of the Antarctic continent, from above.
Okay.
The camellia stands for the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources.
Yep.
And it's about I think, 27, 28 nation management organisation. And it manages the krill fishery and the toothfish fishery and the mackerel icefish fishery around Antarctica, from the sub-Antarctic, if you like, through to the ice.
Okay.
And that's what that sort of gridded map sketch around the motif looks. That's meant to be. It's the waters it covers.
Okay.
So, so every year, all the participating nations in the camellia come to Hobart, and they meet over managing the various fisheries I mentioned. It's quite a complex organisation with many different working groups and hierarchies and whatnot.
Yep.
So I was in a working group dealt with Seabird Bycatch, and prior to one of the camellia meetings, they occurred each October. It might have been September. I was on a longline fishing vessel around Cape Horn, which is operated by Chile. I was doing some experiments, and I decided to take a few photographs. The ones of the toothfish, grenadier, and bait are just ones I took on deck.
Okay.
And I put them together with a photograph that had been taken by an expeditioner on South Georgia, which is in the South Atlantic Ocean. That's a British protectorate, where there's a very large population of wandering albatrosses. And the British are finding that albatrosses, the parents, coming back from foraging at sea, would come back to the island with hooks inside them in their bodies. And they regurgitate these hooks to their chicks, along with the food they'd eat.
Oh.
So the chicks were getting a bellyful, not a bellyful, but hooks down the gullets. Some of the hooks falling out on the ground, and some of the adults had hooks embedded in, like the one in the photograph. So
yes,
photograph of the wanderer's mouth there. That's a compelling picture. It's and the photographs of the fish heads next to it, an excellent counterpart to it. So I came up with this educational poster and put it together very quickly and took it to the camellia meeting that followed a few weeks later after I came back from Chile. And in a very quick time, the scientific committee of camellia had approved the production of the poster, what turned out to be a poster, and committed money to have its printed and put on all fishing vessels fishing in the camellia convention area. So they had to put up in the line hauling bay and in the factory, the key parts of every fishing vessel to educate fishermen about the dangers of throwing discarded hooks overboard. So that was a really good outcome.
Yeah, it's an image that speaks for itself, and I think a lot of the things that people are putting into oceans, they don't realize how quickly they will end up in an animal. In some of your other writing, it was evidenced that you mentioned that some of the biological matter that will create a biofilm on plastics actually will send out similar chemical signals to some of the different food sources of various ocean birds. So they'll confuse plastics with some of their food source and then refeed that plastic back to their chicks.
Yeah, that's plastic ingestion is a big deal in the Northern Hemisphere. It's becoming like that just here in the southern hemisphere as well, but it's not as bad as some parts of the northern hemisphere where there's heavy population centres like Japan and a lot of plastics going in the ocean, and albatrosses consuming plastic objects like plastic cigarette lighters and the starters for fluorescent lights, toothbrushes. They see them floating in the ocean and think they're food and swallow them and come back to the island and feed their chicks. And the chicks get their guts get full of plastic and they end up perishing because they can't digest enough food to stay alive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the microplastics and the plastics you say are much more concentrated in the northern hemisphere. How much of these plastics actually reach the Antarctic, and are they showing up in animals there?
They're certainly showing up in animals here. Microplastics. There's been studies done on shearwaters around Australia, and it's becoming more of a concern. But I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as what's happening in the North Pacific Ocean, largely because of the huge population densities in Asia and the USA. But still, it's a concern down here, and it's something that's it's pervasive. Someone's got to know about it.
And no solution is easy showing up on that one.
No, I mean, the solution's straightforward, isn't it? But it's a matter of getting compliance to the solution.
Yes.
Yeah. That's the hard part. Did you want to talk about that, the dead albatross and the albatross in the...
I certainly do. I'll share that photo again. Let's talk about it. Yeah, so what can you tell us about the albatross? And obviously in this photo, it's such a giant bird. Like, these are really massive creatures. Must be one of the largest birds or types of birds in the world.
Yeah, they got the longest wingspan of any bird in the world, them and royal albatrosses from New Zealand. I should say the birds in the photograph are wandering albatrosses. Okay. And they come from South Georgia in the South Atlantic.
Yep.
And I encountered them in the Tasman Sea. The birds were on their migrations across here, and came to their end on courtesy of the Japanese tuna fishery, which years ago used to fish under a license agreement in the Australian fishing zone. So I went out with several boats studying the problem, and the bird on the photograph on the right, the bird in a person's arms, that's a juvenile bird from South Georgia. I could tell because it had a band on its leg.
Yeah. And
I saw the potential for having a person hold the bird and hold the long line.
Yeah.
It's and just asked for the photo if the person wouldn't mind while I took the shot.
Yeah.
I guess it's easy to see how useful that would be in the conservation effort.
Yes. And
the one on the left, I dived on that bird just to capture how they would look when they're brought at the surface and pulled underwater by the sinking longline and drowned. And the photograph on the left, that's been used by National Geographic, Audubon Society, countless seminars from all around the world on the problem of seabird bycatch, and was used on a billboard inside the airport in Cape Town, South Africa, as a fundraiser for BirdLife International to raise money to save the albatrosses. So, yeah, that's
such a gorgeous, just such a gorgeous and majestic creature, and it really, it does tug at the heartstrings seeing this animal like this and in this state. Definitely.
It's true.
What are some of the most awesome and inspiring and magical things about albatross that maybe people don't know? I know you mentioned they have fascinating mating rituals, and some of what you've already told us about how they can withstand in the winds is very intriguing. Have you got any personal favorite facts about some of the birds that you've studied that you think people just have no idea about?
Well, one of the most intriguing things about albatrosses is their flying capacity. And some species don't breed every year. Some breed every second or third year. For example, the wandering albatrosses that I've already referred to,
Yep.
and another species called the grey-headed albatross. They breed every other year. So they have a year off. And during their years off, these two species can go on a sabbatical. And on that sabbatical, they can traverse the entire southern hemisphere, sometimes twice, around once and around again. Like incredible flying capacity, unbelievable. That work's been done by once the advent of satellite transmitters and GPS loggers came into vogue, then it was possible to find out those sorts of things. But probably with fun facts, I'd say the emperor penguins spring to mind more so than the albies.
Okay.
Because penguins are sort of human-like and they're just pretty funny and absorbing.
Yeah.
There's two anecdotes I could refer to when I was overwintering with the birds. I think the first one is I think it was about May of the year when all the females had left the colony to feed at sea, leaving just the males at the colony to incubate the eggs. And each male with an egg on its feet, sort of low down between its legs in what's called a brood patch. And they huddle together in dense huddles, like you can see in the photograph. Sometimes there might be up to 10 birds compressed into a single square metre of a huddle. They're just packed in tight against the cold. So on one day, the wind had dropped. There's a fierce katabatic wind along the Mawson coast. And when the wind drops, it's not as cold as it normally would be, even though it might be minus on the mercury. That's not too bad for a penguin species that's heavily insulated with fat and got very dense feathers. So must have been the day the wind abated, and one of the males, with egg on his feet, just turned from the huddle and started to shuffle away. And when I say shuffle away, they walk very slowly because they've got this egg on their feet and they just sort of take lollipop steps and shuffle and shuffle. Other males saw what was happening and they gradually turned one by one and followed this male that was just heading away.
Yes.
And it ended up being a line of about 150 male emperors, all about 30 centimetres from each other, all dutifully following the one in front.
Yeah.
Well, going probably, or not even wondering at all. I just stood there watching them, thinking, what's going on here? There must be something that the one at the front knows that no one else knows. It took about 15 minutes of this line of 150 birds just shuffling along, and they sort of move like this when they walk.
Yeah.
And then the one at the front came to a tide crack. The tide crack's just like a fissure in the fast ice. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
But a bird with an egg on its feet can't get over the tide crack without losing the egg. So it just stopped.
Yeah.
The four ones behind it just gradually stopped in procession, like stand up like dominoes, stopped there.
Yeah.
They just stood there motionless for about 7 or 8 minutes. I don't know whether there's heavy thinking going on or what was going on. And then the one at the front did a full 180-degree rotation. So it faced the one right behind it, like this. And then gradually all the other ones behind it gradually turned as well. And they all just waddled back to the huddle. The thing that impressed me so much was that they're such phlegmatic birds, nothing seems to bother them. The ones following, they didn't give the one at the front a hard time. They didn't say, what are you doing, mate? They all just went back into the huddle. Anyway, pretty cruisy.
Business as usual.
Down at Taylor Glacier, I think it was about late November of the year, the birds actually breed on a frozen lake on land. They actually have to get up on land to breed, but they're breeding on frozen water nonetheless.
Okay. And
there's a lot of snow build up where the edge of the colony that meets the ocean, the frozen seawater.
Yeah.
A snowbank built up there. So the birds were coming and going, feeding their chicks, a lot of traffic. The birds are getting big, demanding a lot of food. So there'd be adults coming and going all the time. And they walked on this single pathway. Over time, foot traffic sort of countersunk the path down into this snowbank, so that the pathway was about a metre deep. The birds, when you stood to the side of them and looked, all you could see was their head and shoulders. So on one occasion, I was watching these birds come and go. You'd have a procession of maybe 15 adults with full bellies coming back from the ocean. You might have about 15 or 20 adults leaving the colony, having fed their chicks. And just by chance, these two groups of incoming and outbound birds would meet in the middle of this cutaway. And the sort of the trench, if you like, that they were walking along was only about 60 or 70 metres wide, and an emperor is about, say, 45, 50 centimetres wide, a bit wider than an emperor. So
Okay.
here, those two columns of birds, they just came head to head.
Yeah.
And like it was a standoff. And the two leading birds, they're just standing there, 20 centimetres apart, almost touching bills, motionless. And they stood there for several minutes. You could imagine them thinking, what are we going to do now? I'm just standing here looking at a mirror image of myself. And it's not moving. He's not moving. And eventually they got the birds behind the leading birds got tired of waiting, so they bunted the bird in front. That affected the bird in front of them, and in front of them, and like a pack of dominoes, knocked the bird each one in front over. They fell, and all the birds then just went for it. They all just scrambled all over each other. This Mardi Gras of penguin bodies going everywhere, and somehow the incoming birds managed to get in, and the outgoing birds managed to get out. But that was hilarious, I thought.
They sound like they provided you all the entertainment that you needed to survive a cold winter, keeping you warm with a few belly laughs.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're unreal.
Absolutely curious and fascinating creatures. And I love some of these photos. It's just such a majestic place, and it just seems so strange, all of these big birds hanging out on this frozen wasteland. But they're so adapted to it, and they just know exactly what to do.
Yeah, that's right. They're beautifully hardwired to cope with extreme temperatures. Yeah, they got their behavioural and physiological adaptations are remarkable.
Did you ever have any close encounters? Did they know that you were there? Did they grow accustomed to you? What was the experience like, sort of one-on-one interacting with the penguins, if you ever did?
Yeah, they're pretty cruisy. I kept away from them at the sensitive time of the breeding cycle, and when they had young on their feet like that.
Yes.
Like on the screen now, if I was photographing them, I use a long lens and a tripod to keep away.
And they be protective.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Especially kept away from the males when they were huddling in midwinter. You really don't want to disturb them, and they're very sensitive to extraneous noises. Like if you're walking around on the snow over the sea ice, it can make a crunching sound.
Yes.
And that would disturb them. So I'd say 50 metres away. When the eggs hatch and the chicks emerge, their behaviour changes. Their behaviour is hormonally driven. Birds sort of shuffling around everywhere, and there's a Mardi Gras of sounds and adults trumpeting to their chicks and chicks whistling back. So you get closer then. If you sat down and didn't move, the birds would come right around you and check you out, even though they got chicks on their feet like the one in the photograph.
Okay.
So the sensitivity varied depending on the time of year, but they're hard to sort of. They're not a stressed penguin. They don't, they're cruisy.
They don't get the name Emperor for nothing, huh? So in this job down in Antarctica, obviously you would have to have faced some pretty extreme weather moments. What did you learn about being a cold climate researcher, and what were some of the adaptations of the mind or the body that you've picked up along the way through being in these extreme places?
Well, I went down there with work on the emperors with my eyes wide open. I was sort of mature age. I was about 38 or 39 at the time, and done a lot of field work. And I read a lot about it. Read a lot of the log books from expeditioners from the old days.
Yeah.
I sort of knew what to expect. And I knew you'd adapt to a degree to the cold. You eventually
Yeah.
sort of acclimatise a bit. But I'd say I was really upbeat. I was incredibly enthusiastic about my job,
Yes.
and I couldn't think of anything better than being out with the emperors in midwinter when the sun doesn't rise for a 3-week period. It's 21 hours of darkness and 3 hours of twilight,
Wow.
and the sky goes pink and the icebergs are milky blue color and the birds are doing their thing. It's so uplifting mentally to be there, even though your fingers and face and feet were freezing off. But yeah, I found it comforting to be around the birds, being a animal with the same body temperature as us, and they're coping okay. If it was just a biological desert, it wouldn't be the same, but they were there. They knew what they were doing. They bred in safe places. They could tolerate whatever the climate threw at them. And, I was hugely upbeat to do my job to the max. So a lot of times of, tolerating freezing temperatures, but I was up for it and just, put up with as much as possible.
So the passion led you through the hard times and put everything into context for you and made it all worthwhile.
Yeah, that's right. And it takes something, I'll add that it takes when you only get 21 hours of twilight in 24 hours, you can't get a lot done. And what you do get done takes a lot of work, just the really simple things. I'll give you an example. Back at the island, Macy Island, that you we talked about before.
Yes.
I had an over snow vehicle that used to drive from Macy out to the birds every day. And when it was really cold, the vehicle wouldn't start on its own. It was a diesel engine with glow plugs, but it wouldn't start just on the glow plug. So to start the vehicle, you had to have this other machine called a Herman Nelson, which when I first heard that, I thought it was a person, but it's actually a machine. So it's a small Honda engine sitting above on top of a 20 or 30 litre tank of Jet A1 fuel, special Antarctic blend fuel. And so first of all, you had to start the Herman Nelson, and it would then blow hot air through a kind of collapsible snood device about 30 centimetres in diameter, like a long piece of spaghetti, that you would put on the engine cowling at the back of the front cabin of this oversnow vehicle, and it would blow hot air through the engine bay and out through the radiator. Now, to start the Herman Nelson, I used to douse a rag in petrol, then shove the rag in against the intake manifold of the carburettor and burn it, set fire to it. That'd heat the air in the intake. Then the Herman Nelson would start, blow this hot air. And then you blow hot air through the under the sump area, engine area of the vehicle for about 20 minutes. I used to stand there where the grill was in front of the windscreen with fingers over, take my gloves off and get the hot air coming through. It was fantastic. But just to start the vehicle before you went in there, it took 20 minutes of messing around. And you've only got 3 hours of twilight to work with in that.
Wow. All right. And what about passing the time in those other hours? Are you writing? Are you reading by candlelight or lamp?
Yeah, well, I could push the get a few more hours out of the day by driving with the driving lights going. We had these large driving lights on the roof of the over snow vehicle. You could go out there a bit early and come back a bit later. I spent a fair bit of time in the field hut. With a hurricane lantern, Kero lantern going, and I was often doing work-related stuff, downloading time depth recorders into the computer, or if they're cooking, or if there's spare time, reading a book, but probably not too much of that. Always had one or two other expeditioners with me who used to come out from the station sort of on trips to help out. Okay. You couldn't be there on your own, so there'd be 3-day turnarounds, and then they'd change over. So there was the conversations to be had again and again, and always, a fair bit of trash talking and whatnot. That was fine.
Keep your heart and mind warm.
It's just a matter of you can't fight nature. You just got to go with the flow, and that's one of the good byproducts of being there. You know, you're forced to. You can't get your way as you wish. You just got to fit in, and you can set an ambitious agenda for the day, but when it doesn't work out, just roll with the punches. No, you can't cry over spilled milk, and that's a nice thing about it. Slow down and just do what you can, and let go of other things you can't. You know, if you got a 100-knot wind blowing and spindrift, you know, blizzard, you know, you can't do much. You just got to stay put.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's really fortify the mindset. And yeah, as you say, you have to submit to the natural forces and just become a part of that place flowing to survive. And I think
that's right.
Yeah.
You wake up one morning and first thing you'd notice that all the bottles that might hold candles have vibrated off the little table onto the floor. 100 knots blowing. You couldn't see out the window. It was just spindrift flying past horizontal. And the steel cables holding the hut down to rock bolts in the rock, they're just vibrating, going, you know, you thought, oh, well, looks like we're going to be hut bound for another day. Yeah.
I think it's absolutely probably many passionate young scientists' dream to head to the Antarctic and to do research there. So to have you sharing some of your realities of being on the job and the experiences, and also the mindset that you've obviously cultivated from being there, I think will be really inspirational. So Graham, for students who are interested in both science and the environment, I think a lot of your messages and stories have been super inspirational. But from your perspective, as someone who's been working in the conservation science field for so long in such practical ways, where do you see the most important and exciting opportunities are in conservation for students out there?
Well, if I answered that question, 30 or 40 years ago, I might have a different answer. But these days, with some pretty heavy-duty global imperatives to do with the health of the atmosphere and the health of the biosphere, I might answer it a bit differently. I'm influenced to some degree by having been able to work with an engineering company in Queensland since about 2005-06 on a new technology we developed to set hooks from tuna vessels, that is surface longline fishing boats targeting tunas, set the hooks underwater, like as deep as 10 meters. So basically you can't catch any seabirds that way. I was just impressed by the capabilities of engineers in general. And I think pretty much they can do anything. And I think I would be encouraging young university graduates to think about engineering, or before they start their degrees, to think about engineering and try to link their qualifications ultimately to conservation outcomes. Now, obviously, solar panels, the efforts to decarbonise economies around the world, they're relying on solar panels and windmills and battery production. All those things lie in the field of engineering. But there might be some other creative ways to segue into biological conservation through the field of engineering. I'm not sure, but I think it should absorb a bit of focus.
Fascinating.
The other things are to, dealing with the existential issues, consumption, which relates to per capita consumption, also the size of the human population. The spread of agriculture and deforestation. So they're particularly daunting challenges. But I don't know. Look, it's hard to give advice in these areas. I would try to be pretty honest with the underlying problems.
Yes.
Call a spade and work out where there might be opportunities and openings. You have to do some serious homework on those things.
Yeah.
I think I read David Attenborough's latest book about 2.5 years ago.
Okay.
And off the top of my head, I think there's an attempt at some solutions in that book.
Hmm.
Some things I thought I probably didn't agree with, but the vast majority I thought were a pretty good crack at some solutions to global problems.
Hmm.
That'd be a good book to read, I think, for teachers to recommend to students if they want to stimulate their imagination about where they might find opportunities to try to make a difference.
Right. I'd say that's very grounded and good advice and interesting advice regarding the engineering side here. And I think this podcast in general has been a reminder that science and environmental and biological advocacy and conservation is really a multi-industry process, that photography and the meaning of art is influential, engineering and creating new technologies to innovate pre-existing industries, simply letting the nets drop 10 meters into the ocean or improving the bylines, as you've said, can reduce the impact of 95% of bird deaths, is absolutely phenomenal. And there's likely these innovations to be made in many of these other industries or areas of ecology that need our help coming up in not only now but in the future, where ocean environments, soil environments, forest environments. And where can we think about innovation? What needs a solution? What I love about your story, Graham, as well, is that it was this passion that led you, to work with originally the animals in the arid Australian climate, and then exploring the African climate, and then doing the research with the birds that then almost gave you the foundations to be able to think about how to contribute clearly to the situation and make a real impact. And maybe it's not conservation that gets you into biology and science, but once you care enough about something beautiful or something amazing of the natural world, probably a lot of these thoughts and ideas will come more naturally.
Yeah, actually, they're good points. I suppose the only other thing I would add in terms of advice to university graduates who aiming to bridge the gap between research and practical conservation efforts is to sort of a little bit of this is acts of self-preservation.
Yes,
I would say will establish themselves in their career.
Yep.
And if they have a job in research, then probably be content in establishing themselves and build up a body of information about their chosen discipline, and publish papers in the refereed literature, to become established.
Yes.
And try to aim towards what you might call at least some policy-specific science. May not be just science for the sake of it, but something that might have some relevance to policy. Science may not be all that, but don't forget that entity. And get used to collaborating with policymakers. And then when they're older, segue into management. Now, when I say older, you don't want to get into management when you're 25 because you'll be soul destroying. Get established first. So when the people are happy enough with where they've got in their career, when they're 45 or something or other, if they've got the inclination, get involved in management issues of their choice. I mean, I went into Seabird bycatch reduction in Longline Fisheries. There's lots of other things they can do where you would become involved with multi-stakeholder working groups, domestic and internationally. You're going to get all kinds of opinions around the table and all kinds of support and all kinds of opposition, and try to be pragmatic. And ultimately, if you persist long enough, and choose the right topics. Don't be too ambitious. Then you'll get wins. Once in a while, you'll get wins, and they're pretty satisfying. And persevere. Don't give up, and remind yourself that happiness is expectations minus reality. You'll need that mindset in order to go the distance. Staying power is important if you really want to nudge in a new direction what appear to be impervious or immovable objects. So, and like I said before, do some of this work hand in hand with policymakers. Work as a team, and give it your best shot. And that's all you can do, really. In my work with Longline Fisheries, we had a few wins, but had a lot of kicks in the teeth along the way. But if you throw in the towel, you'll never achieve anything. You got to go the distance and be content with the wins that you do get.
That's fantastic advice. Yeah, overall for the sciences, for life. And I think you're very much a living example of someone who's continued to just build on everything and take your learnings to the world and give it back. And that's such an inspirational story. So Graham, I'd love to hear from you. How, in your mind, can educators and parents do better in sharing environmental lessons to empower students to make a positive impact on the environment?
Okay, well, I don't think I've got any major insights into this, but all I would add is that, if young people shouldn't be exposed to some of the large, seemingly intractable global issues until they're old enough to be able to cope. And I would have thought that age would be when they're at university or even beyond.
Okay, yeah.
Because, make you give up. But for younger people, I've read some books on child psychology, partly because I've got 4 grandkids under the age of 4.5, and I was interested to know about developmental process and how the human brain changes in the first 20 years of life. Without going into too much detail, it's obviously self-evidently important that young people aren't exposed to some of the too much negativity, and I would say shield them from those things.
Yeah.
And focus on homegrown local issues, much smaller scale, where positive outcomes are possible and have been seen to be possible. So what I'd call wins in the past that I've been referring to. Good news stories.
Right, yeah.
Sustainable living practices. Don't allude to underlying problems that are deep-seated. Intractability, humanity. I don't know. I come back to David Attenborough's book and books like it, where there'd be a lot of good news stories where local communities have achieved conservation outcomes that have paid dividends around the world. There'd have to be a fair bit of cherry picking, but I'm sure educators could, if they put in the homework, they'd find lots of examples that'd be suitable par for the course.
Great advice, Graham. And yeah, it definitely reflects our views at Life Rocks. And children need to be inspired. They need to be connected to the world and uplifted. And then that's how they then know how to protect. And I found that also a fascinating point around David Attenborough. I'm a big fan. And critics of David Attenborough over the years would say things like, he's not focused on conservation enough. He doesn't use his platform in order to drive home some of these issues. And then, but later in his career, he actually did, and he produced, the book of which you're talking about, and also another series that really highlighted the human impact on nature, as where prior to that, he hadn't explored it. And I think it was admirable for him to do that at that stage in his career. It really felt like he was, building on it at the right time, I felt, because if you, share too much of the doom and gloom early on, I don't think he would have gotten out the body of work that he did and the sort of support that he did as well.
Yeah, I agree. I had the same feelings about him, a couple of decades ago. The BBC programs, which have been world beaters, and he's still going in his mid-90s.
Yes.
But when I look back in time, what he did was pretty much, I suppose, now I think about it, when I was saying a while ago that for young scientists, what I mean is when they leave university, to establish their careers and, indulge their passions in science and build a body of scientific evidence through the public literature. And when they're in their mid-40s or whatever, segue into management, not jump into management at the age of 25. So they develop and they become pragmatic and understand how the world works before they crack management. And I suppose that's a bit, I suppose you could say the same, look back and say, well, David Attenborough in effect has done the same thing. He's built a huge body of work and expertise that is unique in the world about the natural world through his programs over multiple decades. And then towards the end of it, he's capitalised on his credibility, if you like, that he's acquired. And when he speaks with authority and people sit up and listen. So on balance, I think what he's done's okay in that regard.
Yeah, turned out all right. Hey, Graham, I'm very grateful for our time spent together today. And I think we have covered many of the bases that we wish to in this episode. Thank you for your time spent here. I think there's some awesome lessons, some awesome stories, and we'll be sharing a lot of your photography in this show that'll be interspersed throughout. Is there anything else you would love to share with our audience before you say goodbye?
Not really, thanks, Asher. Probably pretty well talked out. Just to say that it sounds like a great series, and I hope it goes well.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, it's been wonderful. And we're continually excited to have conversations with leaders in their field, especially for those who are doing great work in nature. So thanks once again, and we can't wait to get this episode out. And to the rest of our audience out there, please like and subscribe this show. If you have been watching, this really helps us grow, helps support our awesome guests, and helps support our awesome messages that we want to get out to the world. So don't forget, everybody, life rocks.
Thank you so much for listening to the Life Rocks podcast. If you enjoyed the show, then leave us a review. We'll be back soon with more inspiring content, and in the meantime, remember, life rocks.